Our plans to run a pilot project did not work out as scheduled because the construction of the portable machines going on apace in our biomedical electronics lab was delayed by bugs arising from problems with electronic filters. They were obliged, therefore, to rely on the lab equipment, which we could use only sparingly for each pilot subject once a month for half an hour. We chose psychologically verbal adults for the Theta pilot group because we felt that work with such subjects would more quickly lead to new insights in the exploratory setting we created. We hoped they would help us develop and refine a method for bringing about a state of reverie, elicitation, and recall of imagery, and for investigating the relationship of these variables to creativity. This method we would later apply in research with the college student subjects we had in mind for the formal project. The pilot group consisted of rather special subjects. It included ourselves and several others who had participated in the yoga classes of Swami Rama, discussed in chapter 11. Perhaps this mutual background had something to do with our finding that despite the limited amount of biofeedback practice, production of theta did increase in the group. Another finding, quite unexpected, may also be related. 3 of the 8 subjects who completed the study had ESP type experiences during lab sessions. These experiences will be described in below, but because we are not conducting ESP research, we did not pursue the matter at that time. ESP events were also found with 3 of 26 college students we later trained in the full-scale research on theta reverie. Those findings will be mentioned below in our report on that study. For training purposes, we used autogenic training exercises to achieve relaxation of the body and a quiet inward state of mind. To this, we added the practice of certain breath control techniques, hyperventilation to activate the nervous system, followed by other types of breathing to still body functions and concentrate or focus attention. For lab training sessions, we used alpha and theta feedback from the left occiput with the left ear as reference. Subjects came to the laboratory for alpha theta practice and testing approximately once a month for a total of 7 sessions. They were wired up and taken to the experimental room, a quiet, dimly lit, and safely comfortable place. The first session was devoted to familiarization with the laboratory and the procedures used. The second session to learning the relaxation and breath control techniques. In the next 5 sessions, the subjects received alpha theta biofeedback training. During these sessions, after a preliminary period of relaxation and breathing exercises, the subjects lay down on a couch. The brainwave feedback equipment was turned on, and they began a 30-minute period of biofeedback practice, listening for the tones that would tell them when the desired brain rhythm was present. After the first 2 sessions, only theta feedback was given because the subjects had little difficulty in increasing their percentage of alpha, and we were particularly interested in investigating theta. Each subject's task was to report what was happening subjectively when the theta tone sounded, specifically any imagery, visual, auditory, or somatic, unless or until the tone sounded so often that it was too disturbing to report each time. In the latter case, the subject was asked to report occasionally any imagery or internal happening that seemed especially interested or important. Often more complete and meaningful imagery would be reported after a series of theta tones. If, however, the subject failed to report for a long period of time during which the theta was intermittently present, the experimenter watching the polygraph record assumed that the subject might have drifted too deeply into reverie to hear the tones and signaled over the intercom, asking quietly, "What is happening now?" Some subjects answered, "I wasn't aware of anything." Some said, "I know something was happening. There were images, but I can't remember them." Occasionally, a subject said he did not want to be disturbed, but would report later and did so during the interview at the end of the session. Home practice consisted of the use of the autogenic training and breathing techniques discussed above, without feedback 10 days out of each month. Home practice seemed to be important. We think it may have been responsible for the production of a goodly amount of theta, ranging from 10% to 75% over 10-second epochs. In some subjects who had formerly not been theta producers, they had essentially 0% theta in the occipital EEG lead. Results of this pilot research indicated that for almost all test subjects, the production of theta brain waves increased. Since theta waves are usually associated with the unconscious or near unconscious processes, it was particularly encouraging to find an increase in both the ability to be aware of images when in the theta state and the ability to hold them long enough to report on them. This increase in awareness of images and in the ability to remember them was important because a major problem in studying hypnagogic states is that the material experienced is generally rapidly forgotten. ESP-like events that occurred might not have been noticed except for the fact that subjects were told to make spontaneous reports if an image seemed interesting, and also were asked over the intercom to report whenever their brain waves showed a long-lasting theta state. I was involved in 3 events we did notice. In the first, a young woman was the subject. While she was lying on the couch in the experimental room, 15 feet from the control room and separated from it by a hallway. A research assistant came to the control room and said I was wanted upstairs for a long-distance telephone call. I left the lab in the basement of the research building and went upstairs to my office and on the other side of the building. There I found that Swami Rama was calling about a research plan. When I returned to the control room a few moments later, I heard the subject saying that she had thought of Swami Rama and suddenly had an image of him in the experimental room. He did not say anything, just smiled and stood there for a couple of minutes and then disappeared. Was her thinking of Swami Rama a simple coincidence? Possibly. The next ESP-like event occurred when Dale Walters was the subject. In the middle of the session, a loud crash and thump from the floor above sent me upstairs to ask for quiet during the experiment. When I reached the first floor, I found that 3 workmen had just brought in some large plants in heavy pots for an interior garden they were constructing in the building. One of the plants was intended for a trellis, but at the moment its bright green leaves and supple branches were lying across the trailing over a low fieldstone wall. I told the workers that we were running an experiment, and they said they were through for the day anyway. When I returned to the lab, Alice asked me what had caused the thump. When I told her about the plants, both she and our research assistant laughed. Dale had just said before I entered the room that he had the image of a plant and that suddenly he was the plant, a very green plant that was lying on or falling over a low rock wall. The third ESP-like event happened to me while I was a subject. I had reported a series of images in which Marilyn Moore, our research assistant, was continuously arranging and rearranging some blocks of colored paper on the wall. When I reported these images, I mentioned that the blocks seemed somehow to represent time, and that Marilyn was compressing and stretching them in a variety of ways to make them fit in a given place. When I went into the control room to see my brainwave record, Alice told me that after I had reported on Marilyn's arranging paper blocks, Marilyn had said that during the entire run she had been preoccupied in trying to figure out a sequence of dates and events in connection with her wedding. That morning, a letter had arrived from her fiance, who had formerly worked for us but now was in the Navy. He had explained that their dates would have to be changed because his leave time had been rescheduled. When I reported the blocks related to time, Marilyn was juggling various dates, announcements, showers, visits from relatives, and the wedding date in her head, trying to fit them into a schedule. Before leaving the subject of these ESP events, I should mention an amusing incident which occurred a few months earlier when I was a subject in an experiment in which light was supposed to flash whenever I produced alpha. Marilyn and her fiance, Jim, and Alice and Dale Walters were operating the control room and were upset by the fact that 15 minutes had passed and I had produced continuous beta, not a single burst of alpha. Jim said then, let's make him produce alpha. I will say 3, 2, 1, and then everyone think alpha. They did that, and at the very moment of their alpha, I produced a 1-second burst of alpha. After 5 more minutes without another alpha burst, they did the same thing again, and I produced another 1 second burst. Another 5 minutes, Jim said. Let's do it again, but this time let's think chicken. They did that, but they couldn't fool me. I continued producing beta that time. We mention these results because we believe that events of this kind are not rare, but almost commonplace. Most people have them on occasion, and it seems of some value to admit and accept them. Then perhaps we can get on the job of discovering their significance for psychology and physics. If we still hope to understand ourselves someday, we will have to include all the data. Coincidence could explain some of these events, but beyond a certain point, it seems rather a far-fetched explanation. Reverie and Imagery Project. With the pilot group, we developed the features and methods to be applied in the more formal research with college students. A change was made in our alerting system. The arm-up technique was found to cause tension and irritation. In order to get around that problem, we used resetting alarm clocks which ring unless a bar on top is pressed periodically, advancing the alarm setting by 7 minutes. Money was eventually obtained to support the project, but it was granted by the National Institute of Mental Health rather than the Office of Education. We were happy to receive the NIMH funds, of course, for dollars all have the same color. If our work with college students is promising, sooner or later it would come to the attention of educators. The research was carried out both at our lab and at Washburn University in Topeka. Our subjects were young male students, juniors and seniors at the university. The program consisted of 2 parts as follows. Part 1 was a 5-week period in which we trained students and increased the time spent in those states of consciousness associated with eyes closed, alpha and theta brain rhythms. We had our portable brain wave trainers. For feedback, we used auditory signals as described above, with different tones signifying the presence of different brain waves, low for theta, higher for alpha. The subject's task was to increase the amount of alpha and theta and to become aware of and report inner experiences. Imagery was not mentioned at this time. Subjects were told that we were investigating the possibility of building a better bridge between conscious and unconscious processes and gaining some control of that bridge. When a subject met with us for a laboratory session, he was at first fired up. 2 electrodes were placed on the surface of the scalp at the back of the head in the left and right occipital areas. Feedback was from the left occiput to match the capability of the portable trainers, although brain rhythms were recorded from both left and right. Various other physiological transducers were attached to record other measures we wish to obtain: skin temperature and blood flow in the hands, heart rate, breathing rate, galvanic skin response, and skin potential. Ready to begin in the training room, a quiet, dimly lit room furnished with a reclining chair, the subject commenced with a short period of autogenic relaxation and rhythmic breathing. Then he received simultaneous alpha and theta feedback for 15 minutes, followed by theta feedback alone for 30 minutes. The session ended with an interview, tape recorded, in which the subject described his experiences during the feedback period. Subjects came to the laboratory for a training and physiological recording session every other week. In interviewing weeks, they came to report and discuss what had been experienced during the practice alone, away from the laboratory with the portable brainwave trainers. Washburn University had given us the use of 3 small rooms in which our subjects could practice. We equipped them with portable brainwave feedback machines, reclining chairs, and illuminated clocks. Each subject practiced for about an hour a day on each school day, except on the day when he came for a laboratory session. He kept a notebook or diary in which he recorded his experiences during the practice session. He also recorded his alpha and theta times, which automatically registered on timers attached to the feedback meters. Part 2 followed the same procedure and was again a 5-week training period. During this first period, however, we asked our subjects to be especially concerned with increasing the amount of theta produced. and with becoming aware of and reporting the hypnagogic imagery associated with it. Hypnagogic imagery was defined as imagery that comes suddenly into the mind from some unconscious source. It could be visual or auditory or somatic, a fragrance or a taste. All of these are images in a psychological sense. We found it necessary at this time to introduce the resetting alarm clocks for practice sessions at the university to help subjects avoid slipping into sleep. In their sessions at the laboratory during part 2, subjects were interrupted from time to time during their feedback practice by the question, "What is happening?" asked over the intercom. They responded by telling briefly what they were experiencing just before the interruption. They might be asked this question when mainly beta waves were present, or alpha or theta, or any combination of these. We were, of course, especially interested in the imagery associated with theta waves, but we also wanted to know what was going on in consciousness and when other kinds of brain waves predominated. Notes were made of their verbal reports. During the interview at the end of the session, subjects were asked to elaborate on the imagery and the experiences reported during the session. The imagery was coded for clarifying by a blind judge as to main characteristics on a scale adapted from the Wallach and Kogan 1965 studies creativity variables. It was also classified under 7 major categories: mental events, physical body events, symbolic content, personal content, transpersonal content, and extrapersonal content. These were matched with the brainwaves present at the time they were asked to report. At present, 1/3 of the reports have been classified. Most subjects were able to increase their production of alpha waves quite easily. Theta was more difficult, but was also increased. Most interesting to us was the great increase in the ability to be aware of, hold on to, and report the hypnagogic imagery. In addition to its potential for facilitating creativity, the significance of the study of hypnagogic imagery through theta training lies in what might be learned from the images. Hypnagogic imagery has an autonomous character, seeming to follow its own course independently of the experiencer's will. In fact, attempts to observe it or to closely or control it voluntarily usually make it disappear. One must learn to stand back and be a witness. Some psychiatrists and neurologists have thought theta to be associated only with psychopathology, but this may be because they have observed it mainly in patients. Our studies focused on normal, healthy subjects and used biofeedback methods to explore the relation between specific internal states or states of consciousness and specific brainwave patterns. We found theta to be associated with a deeply internalized state and with a quieting of the body, emotions, and thoughts, thus allowing usually unheard or unseen things to come to consciousness in the forms of hypnagogic imagery. Peter McKellar of McKellar and Simpson, 1954, while under the influence of mescaline during an experiment, used an analogy of hypnagogic imagery to communicate what he was experiencing to the experimenters. He thought it the closest analogy to something they might have experienced. We agree that the changing shapes and colors, the bizarreness of some of the images, the vividness of the experiences, and the many body changes described by our subjects do resemble, to some extent, the accounts of psychedelic and hallucinogenic experiences. 3 of our subjects spontaneously told me during interviews following a lab session they would not use marijuana or LSD again. They found more enjoyment in hypnagogic experiences and liked not only the feeling of being in control, but also the knowledge that what they were experiencing was not stimulated by something they had taken. We had made no inquiries as to whether prospective subjects ever used psychedelic drugs, but we did require their agreement not to use them for the duration of the participation in the project. McKellar suggests that the scientific investigation of hypnagogic imagery is a route by which knowledge of abnormal experiences, whether psychotic or psychedelic, may be gained by the study of normal experiences. That is, we may learn about abnormal experiences by studying the seemingly abnormal experiences that occur to perfectly normal individuals during hypnagogic imagery. Alan Richardson, in his book on mental imagery, 1969, cities researching demonstrating the confusion between the inner world of images and outer world of percepts is present in individuals who are neither neurotic nor psychotic, but well within the range of healthy psychological functioning. We had not anticipated in our research the relatively high frequency of subject reports indicating that integrative experiences leading to feelings of psychological well being were associated with extending alpha theta practice. Training sessions during the first week or two left a few subjects feeling sluggish, fatigued, or nervous, but these effects were only temporary. One subject, for example, after a few weeks of practice, reported having more energy, saying, I don't feel drained all the time. I am able to encounter things easier because it doesn't seem like I'm burning up the nervous energy I seemed to burn up before. I seem more relaxed in my everyday approach to life. Another subject said, I have experienced generally after sensations a kind of speeding up. I feel good inside. Physically, things are in order and I just feel sharper. I've noticed that the sharpness doesn't last, but with me, it's a very precious experience. I have trouble feeling that way. Another described it as, I'm getting clearer and clearer. He described an experience he had. It seems like last Saturday night, something happened to me. Something clicked, and I've just felt different ever since. I'm calmer and I feel more inner peace. I'm just kind of slipped into a state of mind, and I haven't left it much since. If you look at my notebook, you'll see that this week things are picking up. I can get into myself much better. Other subjects put it in other ways. I feel good after a session, like whatever I have to do, I can do. I feel so put together. I feel so with it. Improvement in difficult interpersonal relationships was spontaneously reported too with fathers, one with a roommate, due the subjects felt to growing tolerance and understanding on their part of the other person's point of view. Two students reported girlfriends liked them better, found them more interesting and easier to talk to. Several reported being more at ease in the classroom with their peers and with their professors. There were many reports of reward in schoolwork. One subject who worked at an 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift on a job which allowed him to study said, I had this zoology test coming up. I studied all night, then I practiced alpha theta from 9:30 to 10:30, and I had my zoology test at 11. I had been, tense, but everything went fine. That was funny for me. I was tense about the test. I'd been up all night, and yet I was able to relax and I did just fine. Another time during the interview, following an alpha theta session in the laboratory, the same student reported that he had gathered a great deal of material for a paper that he was writing. Then about with the flu delaying him, and he got tense about the whole situation. There was no time to draw it all together, and besides, he had forgotten everything that he'd read. He had become an insurmountable problem, he told me. Then, during the alpha theta session, he became very relaxed and had a feeling of detachment about the whole thing. In his words, thoughts are so different when you're quiet like that. His mind began drifting through the articles he had read, and he said, everything just seemed to fall together. Another student described his increased ability to concentrate in the following manner. I had a test Monday morning. I stayed in on Sunday evening. I was going to study a little. It was about 11 or 11:30, and I was going to just skim over things. I sat down, and the next thing I knew, it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'd been studying right away, though, through. I was so much into it, I didn't know it. I find myself totally involved now in what's happening. I'm able to let myself get out of the way and enjoy things more mentally. And because I can do it mentally, it's more relaxing for me physically. Several subjects mentioned the feeling of greater involvement in whatever they were doing and also in their surroundings. For example, their increased awareness of nature, the varied colors, the wind, the trees, the sky. Archetypal images, to use Jung's term, were the common experience of a number of our subjects. Images of tunnels, experience of going through a dark tunnel or a tunnel lighted by sunlight at its end, images of stairs, of climbing up or down, images of a cave or a pyramid, images of a pair of eyes or a single eye were reported by several subjects, as was the image of a wise old man in the form of a teacher, professor, or a doctor. Book containing knowledge was another recurring image, as reported by one student. I was in an office and I was asking someone for information. I needed to know something. Then this guy I had never seen before came from behind some file cabinets. He was a great big man and he shoved his paper book at me and said, "The answer to everything you want to know is right here." I paged through the book backwards. There were all these Greek words, Sanskrit words, and in the middle there were pictures. You went through the book and you came to the section on these picture-like things. All the words and the symbols. When I looked at the words, I knew that is the truth. That's what I was after. Quite early in the training, there were reports of increased dreaming, or rather increased awareness and recall of dreams and the imagery of the past events occurring during practice sections, some of them recalling forgotten events of childhood. They were not like going through a memory in one's mind, but rather like an experience or reliving. For example, this from a transcribed report. Last Friday, I got into something different from my practice, a kind of detachment. I began first sort of thinking of a bicycle I wanted to buy, and then I thought of a bicycle I had when I was a kid. And then zap, I was back in my childhood into a whole set of childhood feelings connected with sounds, smells, how the gate sounded, all kinds of things. The smell of the backyard, the whole neighborhood. Must have lasted for 15 to 20 minutes, and I don't even know if I was getting back or not. It was strange. I was just totally lost. And for a while in that experience, really absorbed, really startled by its clarity. It wasn't like, you can just remember about how the backyard looked or how you can think it looked like this. But when you start getting the smells and the sounds, it's different. Such recall of early events brought to mind an article I had read some years before, Imagery, The Return of the Ostracized by Robert R. Holt, 1964. Holt stressed the importance of imagery in memory, concluding with, quote, "I want to mention briefly one speculative implication of the work on imagery, which to me opens the most exciting vistas. Several lines of evidence are being to suggest that the capacity for an astonishingly complete recordings of experience may be virtually universal, and that the problem is primarily one of getting access to the traces. The vehicle of the extraordinary recall is imagery. The indirect means of imagery may furnish the key to this fabulous storehouse of memory. We can learn how to make use of this neglected capacity," end quote. Data training for hypnagogic imagery may be a way of opening the door to this fabulous storehouse of memory. As mentioned above, the state of deep quietness of body, emotions, and mind achieved in theta training seems to build a bridge between conscious and unconscious processes and allows usually unheard things to come to consciousness. Occasionally, this included extrasensory experience. Elmer has already described those that occurred in the pilot group and noted that ESP was not a part of our theta research project. Thus, when a subject reported an image related to something that was happening in the control room, which he would have had no way of knowing through the usual sensory channels, we spoke of it among ourselves, but no indication was given to the subject during the end of the session interview that the image in question was unusual in any way. I recall two extrasensory images that were very simple and clear cut, and the two experiences of a third student, which were quite complex. It first occurred when, in the midst of a theta training session at the laboratory, a visitor stepped into the control room where Dale Regina, our research assistant, and I were conducting the experiment. He had been in the room less than a minute when the subject reported over the intercom from the experimental room. I had just had an image of glasses Our visitor was a tall man with dark hair wearing horn-rimmed glasses. The second occurred near the end of the research program. We had decided to have a spaghetti party at our home when the research was finished to give subjects an opportunity to share their experiences with one another and ask questions that could not be answered during the course of the project. No mention of this had been made to the subjects. When several of us were discussing the party in the control room during a session, trying to decide on a suitable date, the subject reported over the intercom. I had an image of being invited to something. It seemed like somebody I don't know, I think it was Mr. Green, was handing me an invitation to something. There was a little chance that he could have heard us. Are two doors and a hall between the control room and the training room. But since we are not in separate buildings, one can wonder if subliminal perception could have given him information that appeared to come from a non-sensory source. But that as it may, the extrasensory experience of the third student, a senior at Washburn University, is not easy to explain by subliminal sensory process. It also happened near the end of the research on a day when he came to discuss his week's practice sessions at Washburn. He reported the following events. During a theta session just before noon in the early part of the week, he had an image of going home for lunch and hearing his roommate say, "You got a letter from Pittsburgh, Kansas, and one from Wichita. You've been accepted for grad school at Wichita." It was so real that he thought, what's he doing opening my mail? Which brought him so completely out of the quiet state that he decided to end his session and go home for lunch. When he opened the door to his apartment, his roommate greeted him, letters in hand, saying, "Hey, you got a letter from Pittsburgh and one from Wichita. You've been accepted for grad school at Wichita." "Did you open my mail?" he asked. "No," his roommate replied. "I just bent the envelope like this and peeked through the window and saw where it said you had been accepted." The subject went on to tell of the other strange things that had happened during the week. Several times he had known who was calling him before he picked up the phone, when calls were not expected, and in one case, when it was someone who had never called him before. He ended it with, "I don't like this. I don't believe in any of this stuff." The student was a bright, practical person with good sense of humor, but he was a psychology major in a behaviorist-oriented Skinnerian Skinnerian psychology department. He had no frame of reference into which he could fit what had happened. We talked for a while, and he accepted my suggestion to do some reading that might make things that he had experienced seem more reasonable. The student reported one further ESP experience. That he was precognitive. It was a few days after his conclusion of the training sessions. He came for a last conference, and I sensed that he was disturbed when he came in. He paced back and forth and just across the room, and then told me that 3 nights before, just as he was falling asleep, he had had a sudden sharp image of Governor George Wallace being shot. It startled him, but he had shrugged it off as a bad dream, and in a hurry of the many pre-graduation things to do during the next day, it had slipped his mind. While driving to the research building for his meeting with me, he had turned on his car radio and heard the announcement that Governor Wallace had been shot. He didn't want to know such things in advance, he declared. What was his responsibility, he asked. I answered that this is a problem to be considered. However, knowing the general non-acceptance of psychic phenomena, it was my feeling that he had no responsibility to tell anyone that what he had seen. Had tried to do anything in that case, probably he would have been regarded as strange, sick, or maybe even dangerous. We talked about such phenomena simply happening in one's life. If they happen, it may be useful to learn what one can from rather than to deny them. but it is not necessary to seek them. Being psychic is often a nuisance, a distraction, and that is probably one reason why teachers down through the ages have recommended that one not strive for such powers. As one teacher put it, seek ye first in the kingdom of heaven which is within you, and all else shall be added unto you. I spoke with this student by telephone about 6 months later. He was doing well in graduate school and was still using the relaxation and quieting exercises to advantage. He reported no further ESP experiences, but he no longer says, I don't believe in that stuff. We anticipated that there would be an increase in the ability of subjects to become aware of the imagery, and that anticipation was borne out by results, but we had not expected it. As previously mentioned, the relatively high frequency of subject reports from 20 out of 26 subjects associated with integrated experiences with extended theta training. Such experiences led to feelings of physical and psychological well being. It is not interesting that, on the one hand, many outstanding creative people have reported that their greatest insights in physics, chemistry, mathematics, or aesthetics were associated with reverie and hypnagogic imagery. And on the other hand, the imagery and insights reported by college students in the Theta Training Project involved changes in their personal lives. The reason may be that we are all creative, but in different ways. The problems that students are most concerned with are not often the relatively abstruse impersonal problems of classical creativity studies, but pertain to interpersonal relations with teachers, girlfriends, roommates, parents, intrapersonal difficulties, feelings of guilt, insecurity, lack of confidence and self-identity, and attention problems, lack of concentration and inability to organize. If our students had been mature poincaries or kekules, their imagery might have been mathematical or chemical, but not being at that advanced intellectual stage and not being emotionally invested in such problems. Their reported imagery and heightened awareness centered on themselves and personal problems in living. These also are amenable to insight, intuition, and creativity. As noted, we believe they are a common property of humankind. It is in the sense that we say we are all creative. The use of hypnagogic reverie in psychotherapy. A number of psychiatrists and clinical psychologists at the Menninger Foundation and also across the country have since become interested in knowing more about these integrative experiences. They have helped us implement a clinical research program with their patients using a theta training program almost identical to that developed for the college students. Our basic rough hypothesis was and is if psychiatric patients are trained in theta reverie using so far as is possible, the same training technique used with college students, they will tend to have the same kinds of integrative experiences as college students. The unqualified statement may not be fully correct, but from a scientific point of view, it provides a base for constructing research aimed at testing the idea. Upon this base, Alice, Dale, and I have designed a research project called Brainwave Training for Mental Health. 20 psychotherapists representing a variety of approaches to physical and mental health, and 100 patients at the foundation will be part of the subject. Although pilot work with patients has already given us a positive indications of integrative experiences, far more work needs doing before conclusions can be drawn. Theta training, as we use it clinically, is a blend of yoga, autogenic training, and biofeedback training, namely a breathing exercise, relaxation and visualization, and knowledge of results. The body, the emotions, and the mind are trained simultaneously, and the brainwave feedback tells when the desired state is prevailing. In order to produce theta consciously, it is necessary to have a quiet body, tranquil emotions, and quiet thoughts all at the same time. We surmise that it is the state that leads to integrative reverie. Fortunately, the theta training technique is relatively simple and can be used as an adjunctive procedure by any clinician, whatever his or her theoretical orientation. We wish to point out again that the idea of using reverie in psychotherapy is not new. In the world of psychoanalysis, Lawrence Kuby was impressed by the state of consciousness in the earlier years of his long and distinguished career. In the 1943, he wrote, quote, "The hypnagogic reverie might be called a dream without distortion. Its immediate instigator is the dazed, unfinished business, but like the dream, it derives from more remote unfinished business of an entire lifetime as well. Whatever the explanation, with hypnagogic reverie, significant information about the past can be made readily and directly accessible without depending upon the interpretation of dreams. It is probable that this is partial sleep, in this no man's land between sleeping and waking. A form of disassociation occurs which makes it possible to bypass the more obstinate resistances which block our memories in states of full conscious awareness and which can contribute to the distortion of memory traces in dreams." End quote. Kubi induced a state of hypnagogic reverie by feeding back breathing sounds, a monotonous fixating stimulus. He notes that hypnagogic reverie can also be induced by total muscular relaxation. Both procedures have been used by yogis to attain deep focus of attention. We are familiar with two important contemporary approaches in the field of psychotherapy, which makes this use of imagery and the reverie state with which personal integration is often associated. Roberto Assagioli's psychosynthesis techniques, Assagioli 1965, and Ira Progroff's Dialogue House Techniques, reviewed in his recent book of 1975, both use guided imagery. Induced imagery and reverie are being increasingly used in a variety of applications for the treatment of acute neurotic disturbances. Beck, 1970, Lerner, 1969, Vanderberg, 1962. For removal of psychosomatic symptoms, Goldberger, 1952, Chappell and Stevenson's 1936, for inhibition of anxiety, Wolpe and Lazarus, 1966, Paul, 1966, for removal of amnesic blocks, Kuby, 1943, and as a treatment method with emotionally disturbed youths, Trussell, 1974, Tremlow, 1974, and a facilitator of integration in the therapeutic process, Desoy, 1966, and Lunaire, 1969, have also advocated the use of guided imagery as therapeutic method. Chapter 8, Body Consciousness. But in what figure shall we conceive the perfection of the body? An awakening in as great as entirety as possible of the body consciousness and an education and an evocation of its potentialities? Wherever limitations recede, the body becomes more plastic and responsive, and in that measure, a more fit and perfect instrument of the action of the spirit. Quote, Sri Aurobindo. Among the professional students of the humanistic psychology and also of the transpersonal psychology persuasions, there is much discussion concerning body consciousness and its significance vis-a-vis emotional and mental awareness and total psychophysiological well-being. Opinion ranges all the way from only body consciousness means anything to body consciousness is of no great importance. We think that both positions are right and also wrong, an interesting paradox, but not a contradiction. To explain that, we refer again to Aurobindo's concept of interpenetrating energies, which was discussed in chapter 5. In thinking about body consciousness, we again find it useful to follow Aurobindo in regarding matter as the densest form of spirit and spirit as the subtlest form of matter. His idea of transforming the body, making it a perfect tool and instrument, bringing in overmind and supermind energy, has room both for knowing the importance of the body and for realizing its relative insignificance. We think this seemingly contradictory statement expresses an important fact of nature. It is easy to get into a metaphysical debate on this point. Most people are not aware of the basic neurological and existential facts that physiological psychologists take for granted. And those who are knowledgeable, including many psychologists who specialize in the study of sensory perception, do not take into account the basic existential significance of extrasensory perception. Consequently, there has been much confusion and conflict about body consciousness, leading sometimes to extreme positions such as Puritan ethnic and its opposite, the cult of the body. Western science in the last 200 years has conclusively demonstrated that there is no way to experience the world directly. In his 18th century masterwork, Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant established the idea that the causes of our sensations lie outside of us. We will never be able to know these causes directly, but only through the interpretation of our senses. A Kantian way of saying it is that in knowing something, it is not the mind that conforms to things, but things that conform to the mind. Don Juan and Yaqui Indian, teacher of Carlos Castaneda, maintained exactly the same thing. Castaneda put it, 1972. For a sorcerer of the world of everyday life is not real or out there as we believe it. The world we all know is only a description. About 450 BC, Empedocles and some of the other early Greek thinkers had the idea that a ringing bell emitted little ringing bells that were conducted directly to the mind through the door of the senses. Even as recently as 150 years ago, many scientists still needed to be convinced that the sensory of mind of the body never came in contact with the world, but only with the nerves that are agitated by energy from objects in the world. One of the most well demonstrated and accepted facts of modern neurology is that sensory consciousness depends on neural activity in the brain. For example, the rods and cones of our eyes pick up signals from the outside world and convert them into electrical impulses in fibers of the optic nerve, then through neural relays acting like telephone wires. Signals are sent to the visual section of the brain, previously referred to as the occipital cortex, the surface of the brain at the back of the head. If that piece of cortex is damaged, vision is damaged. If any of the nerve pathways or the optic nerve of the retina itself is damaged, vision is damaged. The important point is that the eye is the energy transducer. It converts electromagnetic energy of certain wavelengths, described as red through violet, into nerve pulses. These pulses form an intricate code in the occipital brain. It is not the eye that sees, it's the perceiver in the brain, commonly called the sensorium. It is not the ear that hears, it is the sensorium. It is not the finger that feels, it is the sensorium. An example of this, which we have all experienced at one time or another, is getting hurt while playing a game and being unaware that we are bleeding and hurting until somebody points it out. Only then does the wound begin to hurt. Taking all this into consideration, what is body consciousness? It seems that the correct answer is awareness of all those sections of the sensorium which receive signals from the body. If all the sections of the body, including the voluntary and involuntary organs and tissues, are represented in the brain, as they seem to be, then the phrase getting control of the body really means getting control of the central nervous system. Looked at in this way, we have two obvious boundaries. The first boundary, the skin, separates us from external world. The second boundary is inside, where the central nervous system meets the peripheral nervous system. The two boundaries are represented by two circles of figure 1. The peripheral nervous system interacts with the world outside our skin, and the central nervous system interacts with peripheral nervous system. If the central nervous system is then true, relatively true, inside world, the peripheral nervous system is only a transducer zone and motor zone, operating the voluntary and involuntary parts of the body. And it too is the fact part of the outside world. Because of this, it is somewhat inaccurate and misleading to speak of body consciousness. Not only are we the world outside our skin, we are also not the world between the skin and the central nervous system. It is useful to keep this perspective in mind so as to not get tangled in problems of identity. For example, paraplegics who have lost all sensory and motor connections with the body below the neck are still subject to emotion, thought, pain, and pleasure. Who are they really? Certainly, they are beings of, or if not of, then at least associated with the central nervous system. We will say more about who am I later in depth look at our field of mind theory. Remember that when a sensory nerve is severed or otherwise damaged, there is a loss of sensation of some kind. If that severed nerve end is stimulated electrically, the person will report sensation in the body region that has been isolated. Phantom limb, in case in point, many persons who have suffered loss of arms or legs report sensations, often pain and missing limbs. They feel the limb even though they know it is gone. They are feeling often can be traced to excitation in the severed nerve trunks. Incidentally, such sensations, including pain in phantom limbs, are usually difficult to bring under control. Parenthetically, it is worth noting that a neurosurgeon, Dr. Norman Shealy, in his pain rehabilitation center in La Crosse, Wisconsin, has developed techniques for the control of such pain and other kinds of pains too, through the use of techniques of self regulation, including autogenic like training and biofeedback training. Dr. Shealy told us recently that he had trained 4 paraplegics, persons with severed spinal cords and therefore paralyzed, who suffered intractable pain, presumably due to irritation of nerve endings, to control their pain through learning to turn on alpha, the kind of brainwave pattern usually associated with detachment, the attention turned away from the outside world. It is not easy when in pain to produce alpha in the occipital cortex because the activating nature of the pain signal prevents relaxation. But if a person can nevertheless learn to produce alpha, the pain seems to recede. Sensation is still present at, as a signal, but the agony does not appear. Pain control is to a large extent attention control. Shealy points out in the occult medicine may save your life. Shealy and Freese, 1975. Then after attention control becomes automatic, the pain is automatically under control. Having pointed out that the body consciousness is really awareness in the central nervous system, we will nevertheless continue to use the term body consciousness to use the familiar shorthand that everyone uses when we say, my finger hurts. It is too cumbersome to say agitation of free nerve endings in my finger are being projected into my brain areas that, when activated and when attention is properly focused there, and give a feeling of pain. We now turn to an important tenet of yoga. If kind of certain body consciousness is developed, if one can become conscious in normally unconscious parts of the body at will, then a large number of problems that afflict bodies begin to come under control. Examples cited on the following pages support the idea that body consciousness is essentially ingredient in becoming aware of certainly normal unconscious processes. To become aware of the unconscious in a specific way is often the first step toward mind-body psychosomatic health. An entertaining example that comes quickly to mind was provided by a professor from a university in Arizona. He was attending a members meeting of the Menninger Foundation and took the opportunity to visit us while in Topeka. After a few minutes of conversation, it emerged that he had an excellent understanding of the role of consciousness in the controlling normally involuntarily physiological processes. He told how, about 20 years before, his stressful life had resulted in a stomach ulcer. His doctor said that surgery was necessary, but he decided that if he could become aware of his stomach psychologically, not just as pain, and tell it what to do, he could handle the ulcer by himself. He didn't explain this to his doctor, but was able to postpone the surgery for 6 weeks. By that time, the ulcer had disappeared. We were reminded of Ira Progoff's dialogue method for contacting offending and offended body organs. His most ingenious use of consciousness was in the eradication absorption of hemorrhoids. His theory was almost identical to that of Johannes Schultz. It was necessary to make mental contact internally with the part to know it from inside, not to just feel the pain, but how to make mental contact with the hemorrhoid. How to enhance internal awareness. Knowing that consciousness had to be increased in the offending part, he built a small battery operated shocker that produced electrical stimuli of sufficient intensity to focus consciousness on a particular hemorrhoid. Wiring himself each day was no easy task, he said, but the device was easy to use. He merely pushed the stimulus button that he carried in his pocket and visualized the body absorbing the hemorrhoids. Within a few weeks, they were gone, never to return. Of course, one might say that it has now been discovered that shocking a hemorrhoid will cause it to retreat, and the other nearby hemorrhoids will follow, but that was not my visitor's idea of what happened. After hearing that story, I wanted him to try hand temperature control using the temperature feedback meter without the benefit of autogenic suggestions to see if he could do it the first time without suggestion or previous training. I attached a thermistor to the middle finger of his right hand and showed him how the machine worked, then asked him if he could make his hand get warm. Within 4 minutes, he had increased the temperature 7 degrees. That was a simple task. Then I said, how about trying something more difficult? Making one hand warm and the other cold. He thought that would be interesting, so I attached another thermistor to the middle finger and the other hand, and he tried to produce temperature difference between the two. Usually small temperature difference develops just from the attempt to make a change, but the difference in temperature between the two hands remained almost stationary within about zero point 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit. After 3 minutes, I was about to say that he shouldn't be disappointed that this was not really an easy task and he took some time to learn, when suddenly the temperature needle began to move rapidly, showing that the right hand compared to the left was getting cold. In 1 minute, the temperature had dropped 5 degrees. What are you doing? I exclaimed. He laughed and said that he had goofed at the first. When nothing happened, after a couple of minutes, he realized that his visualization was wrong. His refrigerator had a hinge on the left, and he had always opens the door with his left hand and took out the ice cube tray with his right hand. In his imagination, he had tried to put his left hand on the ice cubes, but his body knew better than that and wouldn't respond. He corrected the visualization, the temperature difference between the two hands changed rapidly. He had discovered himself a fact that we usually bring to people's attention during workshops. It is a body feeling that is visualized, not an abstract idea. Autogenic phrases are used not as magical formulas, but as a kind of map, a set of basic guidelines for the mind and body. Phrases are of no particular use after one knows how to do it. There is a body feeling associated with warmth in the hands that can be turned on at will, and when it is turned on, the hands actually get warm. There is an increase in blood flow. After sufficient practice with a temperature trainer, a person can say, that is the feeling of warmth. It may be a different feeling or different people, even as the smell of rose seems to be different for different people, but each person who learns how knows what is meant. Almost everyone with whom we work eventually substitutes his own unique visualization and feeling for autogenic phrases that are used at first. The professor examples indicated again to us that more than any other factor, certain body feeling is necessary for control of normally involuntary body processes. The problem is to learn how to turn on appropriate body feelings at will. Although psychologists have long thought this impossible, it is now clear that it is impossible. In the same way that it is impossible to control the autonomic nervous system, that is, it is exterior in the textbooks. Students and practicers of yoga, on the other hand, have known for centuries that such control is possible and it can be acquired. This was demonstrated in our lab. The yoga teacher of Rishikesh, India, Swami Rama, was our Swami Rama in residence in the fall of 1970. We thought it would reduce culture shock if he lived at our house, and we were pleased when he accepted our invitation. To provide him and us with additional interaction, we organized a yoga study group. We also hired a research assistant, our son, Doug Boyd, to help Swami Rama with any adjustment difficulties and with details of schedules, appointments, correspondence, etc. Doug had just returned from 8 years in Korea and was especially capable of working with Asian people. Doug published his recollections of his association with Swami Rama and Topeka and other yogis he met later in India in his book Swami, 1976. In chapter 11, we will discuss the results of our research with Swami Rama. What we wish to talk about here is an exercise in body consciousness that Swami Rama gave the yoga study group and later also demonstrated in public. The group met twice a week for 3 hours of discussion and practice of a variety of yoga exercises. Swami Rama called one of these traveling through the body, a person on the floor. And the Swami touched with a yardstick the body areas numbered sequentially in figure 4, allowing 15 seconds between points. As he touched each spot, he said the corresponding number after each person had gone through the exercise once. With another person touching the body area in order to help focus consciousness, it was thereafter done mentally. It is necessary to lie down flat on one's back and to say to oneself, 1. Visualizing as clearly as possible feeling of being in the forehead. 2. Visualizing as clearly as possible being in the throat. The effects of the exercise were always interesting and sometimes were remarkable. Eventually, we ran each member of the Theta pilot group describing in previous chapter, studying brainwave patterns as they went through the procedure while lying on a couch in our laboratory. And they said each number allowed to help us in recording room keep track of their progress. It's not easy to remain conscious and go all the way through the numbers in a quiet, inner focused way. Attention is theoretically not allowed to wander from the body point associated with a number, but that is easier said than done. Sometimes subjects would forget where and were, and we would have to tell them what their last number was. Of particular interest to us was the fact that over a period of 5 months in which our subjects practiced this procedure, among others 10 days per month, or more if they desired, there was a significant increase in the amount of theta production from the occipital cortex during these travels.